Welcome to Untold Stories of Freddie Mercury. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And now, let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The autumn air in London carried an unusual tension that October evening in 1985. The grand ballroom of the Savoy Hotel buzzed with anticipation as journalists, music industry executives, and celebrities gathered for what was supposed to be a routine press conference following Queen's triumphant return from their magic tour. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the assembled crowd, but beneath the elegant facade, something electric was building. Freddie Mercury sat at the center of a long table, flanked by his bandmates Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon. His signature moustache was perfectly groomed, and he wore a crisp white shirt beneath a black velvet jacket that caught the light with every subtle movement. Despite the formal setting, there was something unmistakably regal about his presence, as if he belonged on a throne rather than behind a microphone-laden table. The press conference had begun smoothly enough. Questions about the tour's success, upcoming album plans and the band's creative process flowed naturally. Freddie answered each inquiry with his characteristic wit and charm, occasionally glancing at his bandmates with knowing smiles. The atmosphere felt comfortable, almost familial, as reporters scribbled notes and photographers captured candid moments. But in the third row, a particular journalist sat with a different energy entirely. Marcus Thornfield from the Daily Mirror had arrived with an agenda that went far beyond music journalism. His reputation preceded him, known for his cutting questions and ability to create controversy where none existed. He had built his career on moments like these, turning routine interviews into headline-grabbing spectacles. Thornfield's presence hadn't gone unnoticed by those who knew him. Several veteran music journalists exchanged worried glances, recognizing the predatory gleam in his eyes. They had witnessed his tactics before, the way he would wait patiently through mundane questions, building false security before striking with surgical precision. The room's energy shifted subtly as Thornfield raised his hand. Freddie acknowledged him with a gracious nod, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. The other band members continued their relaxed postures, Brian absently adjusting his curly hair while Roger tapped a gentle rhythm on the table's edge. What happened next would become one of the most talked-about moments in rock journalism history. Thornfield's question cut through the air like a blade, designed not to inform, but to wound. His words were carefully chosen, each syllable calculated to maximum damage. The question wasn't just inappropriate, it was deliberately cruel, targeting the most personal aspects of Freddie's life with surgical precision. The ballroom fell into stunned silence. Photographers stopped clicking, journalists stopped writing, and even the hotel staff seemed to freeze in place. The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, its implications spreading through the room with uncomfortable clarity. Some attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared in disbelief at Thornfield's audacity. Brian May's face darkened with anger, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by protective fury. Roger Taylor's drumming fingers stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching visibly. John Deacon, typically the quiet observer, leaned forward with uncharacteristic intensity. The three bandmates looked ready to defend their friend, but something in Freddie's posture told them to wait. For a moment that felt like eternity, Freddie Mercury sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Thornfield with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the journalist's manufactured confidence. The silence stretched, becoming almost unbearable as everyone in the room held their breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, Freddie leaned forward toward the microphone. What he was about to say would not only silence his attacker, but transform a moment of intended humiliation into something extraordinary, something that would remind everyone present why he was truly the champion of the world. The silence that followed Thornfield's venomous question seemed to stretch beyond time itself. In that crystalline moment, the entire ballroom held its collective breath, as if the universe had paused to witness what would unfold. Freddie Mercury remained motionless, his fingers resting gently on the white tablecloth, his eyes never leaving the journalist who had just attempted to destroy him in front of dozens of witnesses. Those who knew Freddie well could recognize the subtle signs of his internal process. Brian May had seen this look before, during their most challenging recording sessions when technical difficulties threatened to derail their creative vision. It was the expression of a man who transformed pressure into diamonds, who found his greatest strength in moments when others expected him to crumble. The question itself had been a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Thornfield had woven together rumors, half-truths, and deliberate misinterpretations into a verbal weapon designed to humiliate. He had attacked not just Freddie's professional credibility, but his personal dignity, his relationships, and his very identity as an artist. The journalist sat back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, clearly believing he had delivered a fatal blow. But something unexpected was happening in the room. The initial shock was giving way to a different kind of energy. Several veteran journalists began to shift uncomfortably, recognizing that they were witnessing something beyond normal professional boundaries. The attack had been so blatantly inappropriate, so obviously designed to wound rather than inform, that even hardened media professionals felt a sense of unease. Margaret Whitfield from Rolling Stone, who had covered Queen since their early days, felt her stomach turn with disgust. She had asked tough questions herself over the years, but always in service of understanding the music and the artists behind it. What Thornfield had done was something entirely different. It was character assassination disguised as journalism. The hotel staff, trained to remain invisible during such events, found themselves frozen in place. Waiters holding silver trays of champagne stood like statues, afraid that even the slightest movement might shatter the tension that filled the air. The usual background sounds of a busy hotel had somehow faded away, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Freddie's bandmates watched their friend with a mixture of concern and anticipation. They had witnessed his resilience countless times, during the early days when record labels rejected them, during the periods when critics dismissed their theatrical approach to rock music, during personal struggles that would have broken lesser men. But this felt different. This was a public execution attempt, broadcast live to the music world. Roger Taylor's hands had unconsciously formed fists beneath the table. His loyalty to Freddie ran deeper than brotherhood, forged through years of shared dreams, disappointments, and triumphs. The drummer's blue eyes blazed with protective fury, but he remained still, trusting in his friend's ability to handle the situation with the grace that had always defined him. John Deacon, the band's quiet philosopher, observed the scene with analytical precision. He could see the ripple effect of Thornfield's question spreading through the room like a stone thrown into still water. Some faces showed shock, others disgust, and a few displayed the uncomfortable fascination that comes from witnessing a potential catastrophe. The photographers, initially frozen by the unexpected turn of events, began to sense that they might be capturing something historic. Cameras slowly raised, lenses focused, as they prepared to document whatever would happen next. They had come expecting routine promotional shots, but now they sensed they might be witnessing a defining moment in rock history. Through it all, Freddie remained perfectly composed. His breathing was steady, his posture unchanged, his dark eyes still locked on Thornfield with laser-like intensity. Those closest to him could see the slight tightening around his eyes, the only visible sign of the storm building within. But there was something else there, too, something that looked almost like anticipation, as if he had been waiting his entire life for exactly this moment. The silence continued to stretch, becoming a living thing that filled every corner of the ballroom. And then, with the deliberate grace of a master performer who understood the power of perfect timing, Freddie Mercury leaned closer to the microphone and prepared to deliver a response that would echo through music history. When Freddie Mercury finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent his entire life transforming pain into art. The words that emerged were not defensive or angry, but something far more powerful. They were the measured response of someone who understood that true strength came not from striking back, but from rising above. His tone was calm, almost conversational, yet it carried an authority that immediately commanded the room's complete attention. The response began with an acknowledgement of the question itself, delivered with such grace that it initially seemed as though Freddie might simply deflect or ignore the attack. But those who knew him recognized the subtle steel beneath his velvet delivery. He was not retreating. He was positioning himself for something extraordinary. As he continued speaking, something remarkable began to happen in the ballroom. The uncomfortable tension that had gripped the room started to transform into something else entirely. Freddie's words carried a dignity that seemed to elevate everyone present, reminding them of why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. He spoke about the responsibility that came with public platforms, about the difference between seeking truth and seeking to destroy. Margaret Whitfield found herself leaning forward, her pen forgotten in her hand as she absorbed every word. This was not just a response to an inappropriate question, it was a masterclass in grace under pressure. Freddie was demonstrating something that seemed increasingly rare in the entertainment industry, the ability to maintain one's humanity in the face of deliberate cruelty. The other journalists in the room began to shift in their seats, but not with discomfort this time. Instead, there was a growing sense of witnessing something special, something that transcended the usual boundaries of a press conference. Several veteran reporters who had covered countless celebrity meltdowns and defensive outbursts recognized that they were seeing something entirely different. A man who refused to be diminished by someone else's attempt to diminish him. Brian May watched his friend with growing admiration. He had always known Freddie possessed an extraordinary ability to connect with people, but this was something beyond even his usual charisma. This was leadership in its purest form, the ability to transform a moment of potential destruction into something constructive and meaningful. Freddie's response continued to build, each sentence carefully crafted yet seemingly effortless. He spoke about the music industry, about the relationship between artists and the media, about the human cost of sensationalism, but he did so without ever descending to Thornfield's level, without ever allowing anger or bitterness to color his words. The journalist who had launched the attack began to shift uncomfortably in his seat. What he had intended as a moment of triumph was rapidly becoming something else entirely. The room's energy was turning against him, not through any direct attack from Freddie, but through the stark contrast between his cruelty and Freddie's grace. Roger Taylor felt a surge of pride watching his bandmate handle the situation with such extraordinary composure. This was the Freddie he knew, the man who could take the worst that life threw at him and somehow transform it into something beautiful. It was the same quality that had driven their greatest songs, the ability to find light in darkness and hope in despair. As Freddie's response reached its crescendo, his voice took on the same quality that had made him one of the greatest performers of his generation. There was passion there, but it was controlled passion, channeled into something constructive rather than destructive. He was not just defending himself, he was defending the very idea that public discourse could be conducted with dignity and respect. The photographers continued to capture every moment, their cameras clicking softly as they documented what was clearly becoming a historic moment. They could sense that something was building in the room, an energy that went beyond the usual dynamics of a press conference. And then, as Freddie's response reached its conclusion, something unprecedented began to happen. The transformation that had been building throughout his speech suddenly crystallized into action, as the audience began to respond in a way that no one in that ballroom would ever forget. It started with Margaret Whitfield, the seasoned Rolling Stone journalist, who had covered everyone from the Beatles to the Rolling Stones, found herself slowly rising from her chair as Freddie's words reached their powerful conclusion. She had witnessed countless press conferences throughout her career, but nothing had ever moved her quite like this moment of pure dignity, triumphing over deliberate cruelty. Her movement was subtle at first, almost unconscious, as if her body was responding to something her mind hadn't yet fully processed. But as she stood, her action created a ripple effect that spread through the ballroom like wildfire. The veteran music journalist from The Times followed suit, then the photographer from NME, then the correspondent from BBC Radio. One by one, the assembled media professionals began to rise from their seats. These were not naive fans easily swayed by celebrity charm. These were hardened journalists who had seen every trick in the book, who prided themselves on their professional skepticism. Yet here they were, standing in spontaneous tribute to a response that had transcended the usual boundaries of entertainment journalism. The hotel staff, initially confused by the unprecedented scene unfolding before them, began to understand what was happening. The waiters and event coordinators, who had served countless celebrity events in this very ballroom, had never witnessed anything quite like this. They too began to stand, their silver trays forgotten, their professional invisibility abandoned in favor of participating in something extraordinary. Brian May felt tears welling in his eyes as he watched the room transform around his friend. He had always known Freddie possessed something special, but seeing it recognized so spontaneously by a room full of strangers was overwhelming. The guitarist rose from his own chair, followed immediately by Roger and John, the three bandmates standing in solidarity with their friend, who had just demonstrated why he was truly irreplaceable. The applause began slowly, tentatively, as if the audience wasn't quite sure whether such a response was appropriate in a press conference setting. But as more people joined in, the sound grew stronger, more confident, until it filled the entire ballroom with thunderous appreciation. This wasn't the polite, measured applause typical of media events. This was genuine, heartfelt recognition of something remarkable. Marcus Thornfield remained seated, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. His calculated attack had not only failed spectacularly, but had backfired in the most public way possible. The journalist who had built his career on creating controversy found himself isolated in a room full of his peers, all of whom were demonstrating their rejection of his tactics through their unprecedented response. The standing ovation continued to build, lasting far longer than anyone could have anticipated. Photographers abandoned their professional detachment, some lowering their cameras to participate fully in the moment. The sound of applause mixed with voices of appreciation, creating a symphony of respect that seemed to shake the very foundations of the historic hotel. Freddie himself appeared genuinely moved by the response. The man who had performed for stadium crowds of 80,000 people seemed almost overwhelmed by this intimate display of support from a much smaller but equally significant audience. His dark eyes glistened with emotion as he looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had chosen to stand not for his fame or his music, but for his character. The moment stretched on, becoming something that transcended its original context. This was no longer just a press conference, or even just a response to an inappropriate question. It had become a statement about the kind of discourse that was possible when people chose dignity over destruction, grace over cruelty. As the applause finally began to fade, the audience slowly returned to their seats, but the energy in the room had been permanently transformed. What had begun as a routine media event had become something that would be talked about for decades to come, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful responses come not from fighting fire with fire, but from choosing to be the light in someone else's darkness. The aftermath of the standing ovation left the ballroom in a state of transformed energy that no one present would ever forget. As the applause finally subsided and people slowly returned to their seats, there was a palpable sense that something historic had just occurred. The usual professional distance between journalists and their subjects had been temporarily dissolved, replaced by a shared recognition of human dignity that transcended the typical boundaries of a press conference. Freddie Mercury remained standing for a moment longer, his hand resting gently on the microphone stand, as he surveyed the room with genuine gratitude. The man who had commanded stadium crowds around the world seemed genuinely humbled by this intimate display of support. His eyes moved slowly across the faces before him, acknowledging each person who had chosen to stand with him in that crucial moment. Margaret Whitfield found herself wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. In her 30 years of music journalism, she had covered protests, riots, and revolutionary moments in rock history, but nothing had moved her quite like witnessing grace triumph over malice in such a personal, immediate way. She looked around the room and saw her own emotions reflected in the faces of her colleagues, hardened professionals who had been reminded of their own humanity. The other band members remained standing beside their friend, their solidarity unspoken but unmistakable. Brian May's usually gentle expression carried a fierce pride as he watched Freddie handle the situation with such extraordinary composure. Roger Taylor's protective instincts had been replaced by admiration, while John Deacon's quiet observation had given way to visible emotion at seeing his bandmate's character so publicly vindicated. Marcus Thornfield sat alone in his chair, surrounded by empty seats as his neighboring journalists had moved away during the ovation. His face had cycled through embarrassment, anger, and now settled into a sullen resentment. The man who had arrived with such confidence in his ability to create controversy found himself completely isolated, his tactics not just rejected, but publicly repudiated by his own professional community. The hotel staff, still processing what they had witnessed, began to move with renewed purpose. The waiters who had frozen during the confrontation now carried themselves differently, as if they too had been elevated by participating in something meaningful. The event coordinator, a woman who had managed countless celebrity appearances, found herself making mental notes about this moment that had redefined her understanding of what true star quality actually meant. As the room settled back into its formal configuration, the energy remained fundamentally changed. The questions that followed were markedly different in tone, more respectful, more thoughtful, more focused on the music and artistry that had brought everyone together in the first place. It was as if Freddie's response had reminded everyone present of their better angels, of the possibility for public discourse to elevate rather than destroy. The photographers continued their work, but their approach had shifted as well. Instead of hunting for unflattering angles or moments of vulnerability, they seemed to be documenting something precious, a reminder that dignity and grace could still triumph in an increasingly cynical world. Their cameras captured not just images, but the essence of a moment that would be remembered long after the technical details were forgotten. The press conference continued for another hour, but the dynamic had been permanently altered. Questions were more substantive, responses more thoughtful, and the entire interaction carried a weight of mutual respect that had been absent from the beginning. It was as if everyone present understood they had been part of something special and were determined to honor that experience. As the formal portion of the event drew to a close, there was a reluctance among the attendees to leave. People lingered, engaging in conversations that went beyond the usual professional networking. They had shared something profound together, and the ordinary world outside the ballroom doors seemed somehow less significant than the transformed space they had created together. As the formal press conference concluded, the ripple effects of what had transpired began to spread far beyond the confines of the Savoy Hotel ballroom. Margaret Whitfield was already mentally composing her article, knowing that she had witnessed something that would define not just Freddie Mercury's legacy, but the very standards by which public figures should be measured. Her fingers trembled slightly as she packed her recording equipment, the weight of responsibility to capture this moment accurately pressing heavily upon her shoulders. The other journalists filed out slowly, many stopping to exchange contact information and thoughts about what they had just experienced. These were professionals who typically maintained strict boundaries between their personal feelings and their reporting duties, yet the evening had challenged those conventions in the most profound way. Several veteran reporters found themselves questioning their own past approaches to celebrity interviews, wondering if they had ever contributed to the kind of destructive journalism they had just witnessed being so eloquently rejected. Brian May approached Freddie as the crowd began to thin, placing a gentle hand on his friend's shoulder. The guitarist's eyes conveyed everything that words could not express: pride, admiration, and a deep understanding of the courage it had taken to respond with such grace under such public pressure. The bond between the bandmates had always been strong, but moments like these reminded them why their friendship transcended mere professional collaboration. Marcus Thornfield gathered his belongings with visible haste, clearly eager to escape the scene of his professional humiliation. His notebook remained largely empty, his planned follow-up questions abandoned in the wake of his spectacular miscalculation. As he moved toward the exit, other journalists stepped aside, creating a subtle but unmistakable path of isolation around him. The message was clear. His tactics had been rejected not just by his target, but by his entire professional community. The hotel staff began their cleanup with unusual reverence, as if they were preserving a sacred space rather than simply resetting a conference room. The waiters who had served champagne found themselves handling the empty glasses with extra care, as if these ordinary objects had been transformed by their proximity to something extraordinary. The event coordinator made detailed notes about the evening, knowing that future events in this space would inevitably be measured against what had occurred here. Outside the ballroom, word of the evening's events was already beginning to spread through London's tight-knit music community. Phone calls were being made to editors, producers, and industry executives who hadn't been present but needed to understand the significance of what had transpired. The story was taking on a life of its own, growing beyond the confines of a single press conference into something that would influence how the entertainment industry conducted itself for years to come. Freddie himself seemed to be processing the evening's events with characteristic thoughtfulness. The man who could command a stadium crowd with a single gesture appeared genuinely moved by the intimate support he had received from a room full of strangers. His usual post-event energy was tempered by a quiet reflection, as if he too understood that something significant had shifted in the landscape of public discourse. The photographers who had captured the standing ovation knew they possessed something special. Their images would become iconic, not just for their technical quality, but for their documentation of a moment when humanity triumphed over cynicism. These photographs would appear in magazines and newspapers around the world, but more importantly, they would serve as visual reminders that dignity and grace could still prevail in an increasingly harsh media environment. As the evening wound down and the last attendees finally departed, the ballroom stood empty but somehow transformed. The crystal chandeliers cast the same warm light they had hours earlier, but the space itself felt different, elevated by what it had witnessed, sanctified by the triumph of character over cruelty that had played out beneath its ornate ceiling. In the days that followed the Savoy Hotel press conference, the story took on a momentum that surprised even the most seasoned media observers. Margaret Whitfield's article in Rolling Stone became one of the magazine's most widely shared pieces of the decade, not because of scandal or controversy, but because it captured something increasingly rare in entertainment journalism, a moment of genuine human triumph over manufactured adversity. The piece resonated far beyond the typical readership of music magazines. Newspapers across Europe and America picked up the story, each adding their own perspective on what had become known as the Savoy moment. Editorial writers used it as a launching point for broader discussions about media responsibility, the treatment of public figures, and the possibility for grace under pressure in an increasingly cynical world. Television news programs, initially skeptical about covering what seemed like a minor entertainment industry incident, found themselves drawn to the story's deeper implications. The footage of the standing ovation, captured by multiple cameras, became a powerful visual symbol that transcended its original context. Viewers who had never heard of Queen found themselves moved by the image of a room full of hardened journalists rising to their feet in spontaneous tribute to human dignity. Within the music industry itself, the reverberations were even more profound. Record executives who had built careers on manufactured controversy began to question their approaches. Publicists started incorporating dignity clauses into their media strategies, using the Savoy incident as a template for how their clients should handle hostile questioning. The event had essentially created a new standard for public behavior that other artists would be measured against for years to come. Marcus Thornfield's career trajectory took a dramatically different turn. The journalist who had arrived at the Savoy with such confidence found himself increasingly isolated within his own profession. Editors who had previously valued his ability to create controversy began to distance themselves from his methods. The Daily Mirror, facing criticism for their reporters' tactics, quietly reassigned him to less prominent stories. His attempt to destroy Freddie Mercury had instead destroyed his own reputation within the industry he had worked so hard to establish himself in. For Queen as a band, the incident marked a turning point in their relationship with the media. The respect that Freddie had earned through his graceful response extended to his bandmates, creating a protective buffer around the group that would serve them well in the challenging years ahead. Journalists who might have previously pursued aggressive angles found themselves approaching Queen with a newfound respect, understanding that they were dealing with artists who had demonstrated their character under the most intense pressure. The other attendees of that evening found their own careers subtly but significantly affected by their participation in the moment. Margaret Whitfield received offers from major publications who wanted to associate themselves with the kind of thoughtful journalism she had demonstrated. The photographers who had captured the standing ovation found their images in high demand, not just for their historical significance, but for what they represented about the possibility of positive human interaction in public spaces. Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon watched with pride as their friend's moment of grace continued to generate positive attention for the band. They had always known Freddie possessed extraordinary character, but seeing it recognized so widely by people who had never met him personally validated their own faith in their friend and collaborator. The incident had reminded the world why they had chosen to make music with this remarkable man. The Savoy Hotel itself became an unlikely beneficiary of the evening's events. The ballroom where the press conference had taken place was quietly renamed the Mercury Room by staff members, though this designation never appeared in official hotel literature. Event planners began specifically requesting the space, hoping that some of the magic of that evening might influence their own gatherings. Years later, as Freddie Mercury's life drew toward its inevitable conclusion, the Savoy Hotel incident would be remembered as one of the defining moments that revealed the true measure of the man behind the legend. The press conference that had begun as a routine promotional event had evolved into something far more significant, a masterclass in grace under pressure that would influence public discourse for generations to come. Margaret Whitfield, now a senior editor at Rolling Stone, kept a framed photograph from that evening on her office wall. The image captured the exact moment when the standing ovation reached its peak, with Freddie's face showing a mixture of humility and gratitude that perfectly encapsulated his character. She often pointed to it when mentoring young journalists, using it as an example of how the most powerful stories often emerged not from conflict, but from moments of unexpected human connection. The recording of Freddie's response became required listening in journalism schools across the world, studied not for its entertainment value, but for its demonstration of how public figures could maintain their dignity while addressing hostile questioning. Communications professors used it to teach students about the power of measured responses, the importance of taking the high road, and the way that grace could transform potentially destructive situations into opportunities for positive change. Brian May, in interviews given decades after that evening, would often reflect on how the incident had revealed something essential about his friend's character. The guitarist spoke of how Freddie's response had demonstrated the same qualities that made him such an extraordinary performer: the ability to connect with an audience on a deeply human level, to transform raw emotion into something beautiful and meaningful, and to find light in even the darkest moments. The ballroom at the Savoy Hotel continued to host countless events over the years, but staff members who had been present that evening never forgot what they had witnessed. New employees were told the story during their training, not as entertainment, but as an example of how their venue had once been the setting for something truly special. The space itself seemed to carry a different energy, as if it had been permanently elevated by what had occurred within its walls. Marcus Thornfield eventually left journalism altogether, finding work in corporate communications where his aggressive tactics were less likely to backfire so spectacularly. He never publicly acknowledged his role in creating one of the most celebrated moments in entertainment journalism history, but those who knew him understood that the Savoy incident had fundamentally changed his understanding of the power and responsibility that came with public platforms. The broader impact of that evening extended far beyond the entertainment industry. The phrase Savoy moment entered common usage as a description of any situation where grace triumphed over aggression, where dignity defeated deliberate cruelty. Politicians, business leaders, and public figures of all kinds found themselves measured against the standard that Freddie had set that October evening in 1985. As news of Freddie Mercury's death spread around the world in November 1991, many of the obituaries and tributes specifically mentioned the Savoy Hotel incident as an example of his character. The moment had become part of his legacy, proof that his greatness extended far beyond his musical abilities to encompass the very essence of what it meant to be a decent human being under extraordinary pressure. The standing ovation that had erupted spontaneously in that London ballroom had in many ways never truly ended. It continued to echo through the years, a reminder that in a world often dominated by cynicism and cruelty, there was still room for grace, dignity, and the kind of human connection that transcended professional boundaries and touched something deeper in the human spirit. The reporter had indeed tried to humiliate Freddie Mercury in public, but his reply had done something far more powerful than simply defend himself. It had reminded everyone present of their capacity for goodness, creating a moment that would inspire people for generations to come. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming emotional and inspiring tales about Freddie's life and legacy. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and often your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.